pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
When I first started writing the book, my impression was that music was everywhere during the Civil War, and I got this impression from Hollywood more than from history books. Historians have mentioned Civil War music in the past, but they've been it's more prevalent in popular representations of the war, the Ken Burns series and movies like Gettysburg, movies like Lincoln. And once I started looking into it, I realized that this was true. From looking at letters and diaries and memoirs, almost every letter collection and any of these sources at least had one mention of music. I don't think anyone went through the Civil War without mentioning music at least once in the things that they wrote. It was performed in all aspects of life. It was performed in parlor pianos at the home. It was performed by regimental bands in the armies, at political rallies, and of course it was also sung by slaves and runaways and freedmen. But what's astounding about these songs is how the emotional resonance they have, in some cases for us today. It's difficult to find other wars in the American experience with as many songs that still have resonance. Everyone here, if I was to play Dixie for you, or the Battle Hymn of the Republic, or Battle Cry of Freedom, When Johnny Comes Marching Home, you would recognize all of these songs. You would probably know a little historical context for each of them. That's rare. And in some cases, too, it's rare because we remember them the way they remember them. For instance, Dixie was not originally written to be the Confederate anthem, but we all think of it as the Confederate anthem because the Confederates made it their anthem. We don't think of it as a minstrel tune that was written before the war even broke out. And so it's interesting the way these songs have such resonance for us today, and it's because they had such deep resonance for Americans during the Civil War. Songs were one of the most valuable ways for Americans to communicate ideas, and one of the ways that they used to understand the war. One of the key reasons for this is because music in the Civil War was less of a personal. Now we listen to music individually, or sometimes at a concert, but usually individually. And we usually don't participate with the performance at all either. We might sing along in our car, but we don't sing as a group when a song is performed. But during the 19th century, that wasn't the case. Music was often performed in groups. Everyone was expected to join in. And so it made music a very valuable way to communicate ideas. And literacy, of course, wasn't required. You could transmit this orally. You didn't have to know how to play an instrument. You didn't have to know how to read music. You didn't have to know how to read the English language. According to a magazine out of Princeton in February 1864, the author is discussing music, comparing it to other art forms. He said, "These other art forms have no power, exercise no influence over the lower classes of mankind, the uneducated world. They require a certain cultivation of the mind, which comparatively few possess. Whereas with music, how different. All are influenced by it. The high, the low, the rich, the poor, the educated, and the uneducated. And I would add the black and the white. A heart of stone is made to yield, and even inanimate objects seem to feel its power. Similarly, like I said, you don't need to have a lot of skill with music. A member of the 51st Indiana Regiment, William R. Hartpence, wrote down that soldiers enjoyed the music of the military bands, but our voices we had with us all the time. And when in camp or on the march, it was no uncommon thing for one to start a song and then for the whole regiment to join in the chorus. Each one was a master, and the less melody or mellowness a voice possessed, the greater reason it seemed for cultivating it. So you can see, I mean, these people are enthusiastically talking about the role of music in their society, and they're all capable of interacting with music. Soldiers were accustomed to singing. It wasn't like now if I asked one of you to get up and sing, you'd be reluctant to do so. The 19th century, you might not have been as reluctant to do so. You might have got up and sang. I also would have probably sang some of the songs I'm going to talk about today, which I have no intention of doing. Part of the reason for this is because the American music industry had really developed in the decades leading into the Civil War. One of the primary reasons for this is the availability of pianos. Since the American Revolution, pianos had been steadily decreasing in value in America, which is exceptional. This is not happening in the rest of the world. By the time the Civil War breaks out, there's about 110 piano manufacturers in the country. The largest and most successful of them is Chickering and Sons. By the middle of the Civil War in 1863, Chickering and Sons, which is in Boston, was producing 42 pianos a week. They employed 500 people. And they produced instruments that some believed rivaled the best of the European piano manufacturers. A quality piano at the Civil War was about $250, which adjusted for inflation is about $4,400 today. So it's an expensive item, but it's not out of reach for a middle-class family. But cheaper models could be purchased for as low as $100, which is about $1,750 today. And of course, if you didn't want to buy piano, guitars and melodeons and all kinds of other instruments were available. And again, this is exceptional. In Europe, particularly pianos were primarily limited to the upper classes. So the fact that most Americans can afford a piano is a kind of democratizing aspect and is part of the reason why public singing is so common. Similarly, a sheet music industry builds up around this, selling cheap sheet music with lots of eager people to write for it. Lowell Mason starts selling hymn books in the 1830s and 40s and is the first to realize that you can make a profit off of selling this kind of music. And the real success story is Stephen Foster, who wrote songs like Oh Susanna and Camptown Races, and for a time lived off of songwriting alone. It was his career. He was the first to effectively do so. And so around this, a parlor tradition develops where middle-class and upper-class families would have a parlor in their home with a piano or some other musical instrument in it, which they would play at night, and they would gather around and they would sing together. And by this way, again, family singing and public singing gets disseminated. And then there's these other public venues like rallies and things like that. So when the war arrives, America's primed to want to interact with the war in a musical way. They want to deal with the issues of the war. They want to express their own ideas about the war, and a lot of them are going to look to music to do so. 1 year into the war, the Saturday Evening Post declares that a, quote, flood of new songs has greeted the war. The Chicago song music publisher, Root and Katie, one of the most successful wartime song publishers, reports that they received between 50 to 70 new submissions a day. Around 9,000 and 10,000 different songs were published during the Civil War. A small number of that in the Confederacy, about 600 to 700, because of the blockade. But even in the Confederacy, with those small numbers, music outstripped every other form of literature except for newspapers. And these are just different songs. I'm not talking about the actual pieces of sheet music, just different individual songs. Furthermore, because these songs are being performed in groups, and because everyone is getting their own sheet music and being able to sing it, or they're learning it orally, everyone gets to put their own spin on these songs. We don't think of these songs, don't think of them as static the way we would a song today. If I were to name a prominent song to you, like Jailhouse Rock by Elvis Presley, you would all hear the exact same version of Jailhouse Rock in your head that I just heard, because you've heard it on the radio. You've heard Elvis sing it. People then didn't have these kind of ultimate versions of songs. They would perform them themselves. Most had never heard the song published by the songwriter. In fact, some songwriters like Foster rarely perform their own songs. So everyone would have their own version. So these songs would go through these transformations. The best example of this during the war is the song John Brown's Body. John Brown's Body is written by soldiers, members of the 2nd Massachusetts Battalion. They based it on a revival hymn of unknown origin called Say Brothers, Will You Meet Us on Canaan's Happy Shore. They write it as an inside joke about a sergeant named John Brown in their regiment, and it becomes phenomenally popular. It's now written by professional songwriters, it's written by soldiers, becomes, I argue, the most popular patriotic song in the North, and of course gets converted by Julia Ward Howe just down the street to the Ballad Hymn of the Republic at the end of 1862, which then becomes popular, I found, at the end of the war and afterwards. But this is all the same song. This is all just people performing the same song and putting their own spin on it. Granted, we now think of the Ballad Hymn of the Republic as being kind of the ultimate form of that song. The Ballad Hymn of the Republic was just one of many revisions, some of which got written down, some of which didn't. Part of what made John Brown's Body so popular among soldiers and civilians is that they could put their own spin on it. You could make up your own lyrics. It's a very simple song. So the fact these songs could then be, they're so malleable, people could use them in a variety of ways. They could use them to express political opinions. They could use them to resist authority. Confederate women used music to resist Union occupation. Slaves used music to resist their masters and then to express their freedom once they achieved it. And so all of this combines to make the Civil War sort of a war fought to music. Going into the Civil War, the most popular genre of music in America were ballads, sentimental pieces, these sort of romantic songs. These tend to deal with subjects dealing with separation, sweethearts separated, and so going into and death actually was big in them too. Going into the Civil War, these were a very popular genre. The most popular song in America before, during, and after the Civil War was probably Home Sweet Home, which is a good example of this sort of song. Similarly, going into the Civil War, The Girl I Left Behind Me is popular during the war, which is a pre-war song that has the same kind of the soldier remembering the girl he left at home. The top-selling sentimental song of the war was Weeping Sad and Lonely, or When This Cruel War Is Over, which has these same, it's a couple with the soldier saying he's going to go enlist and telling his sweetheart that they will reunite when this cruel war is over. It was written by Charles Carroll Sawyer, who's noteworthy because he was the only songwriter that I found who actually put his name on sheet music when it sold in the Confederacy and the Union. I don't know how he pulled this off, but both sides, they didn't recognize each other's copyright, so they were frequently publishing each other's songs and claiming they were their own. But Sawyer, for some reason, manages to get his name on the sheet music on both sides. He's Northerner. He's from New York. He publishes his own music, actually. But it was very popular on both sides. There's a Confederate and a Union version. They changed the color of the uniforms and the lyrics. And by the end of the 19th century, it had sold about 1 million copies. So this is a huge hit. And again, that's just sales. This doesn't account for the amount of amateur songwriting that's also going on. However, although these sentimental songs are prominent going into the war, and although more sentimental songs are published during the war than any other kind of music, from reading the diaries and letters of soldiers during the war, newspaper reports, things like that, it's clear to me that patriotic or martial music was by far the most popular type of music during the Civil War. And that's because it fit the need of what people wanted more. What people wanted from their music in the Civil War was a way to interact with the issues of the war and the emotions of the war, and martial and patriotic songs did that better than sentimental songs did. The other reason is because this is a war we're talking about. And in a war, there are soldiers. And not only are there soldiers, but there's mobile soldiers. Soldiers are marching all over the country. As a result, the soldiers exerted an enormous influence on popular taste during the Civil War. The songs the soldiers liked were the songs everybody else eventually ended up liking. As these soldiers wind their way through the country, either as armies or in individual units, they're coming in contact with civilians, they're encamping near urban centers, and they're singing songs. And the people surrounding these camps are learning these songs. As the abolitionist and women's rights advocate and author Lydia Maria Child wrote, Nothing on earth has such effect on popular heart as songs which the soldiers would take up with enthusiasm and which would thereby become the fashion to whistle and sing on street corners. And she was absolutely right. It's the patriotic songs the soldiers adapt, the marching tunes the soldiers adapt, have the greatest influence, are performed more often, I found, than any other form of music. Eventually, each side adopts two major anthems, two major war anthems. In the Union, of course, the Union already has the Star Spangled Banner isn't the official national anthem during the Civil War. There's about 5 contenders to be the national anthem during the Civil War. So these are more war anthems as opposed to their national anthems. But 2 main war anthems emerge in the North, and those are John Brown's Body and the Battle Cry of Freedom. In the Confederacy, where they have to find a national anthem, 2 contenders emerge, and that's Dixie and the Bonnie Blue Flag, neither of which the Confederates are entirely happy with, but that will have to stay on the shelf for now. And so these songs become enormously popular and in a lot of ways characterize the music of the war. And there's all kinds of other examples that I could cite. I'm running low on time, so just to close off, and to bring it back to the Marine Band, where the rest of this discussion is going to go, the Marine Band as a prominent military musical band, its experiences during the war exemplify many of the things I just talked about. Mary Lincoln at one point cancels their free weekly concerts, and the members of the public protest because they want this music. They want ways to listen to the martial music that they're used to. But the Marine Band didn't play as much martial music. There's also a conflict that goes on over the kinds of music the Marine Band will play. There's a conflict in the 19th century between this higher, more cultured music and the low popular music, which is the kind that I'm talking about. And there's a real argument that takes place over whether the Marine Band should play more of these popular airs, because the public demands it. But the Marine Band wants to play more kind of cultured, or what we would today call classical music. And the members of the public that go to these free concerts, they want to hear more of the kinds of songs that they're used to. Being John Brown's Body, the Battle Cry of Freedom, or the anthems like Yankee Doodle and the Star Spangled Banner. So all these illustrate, again, this demand for popular music and this demand for martial music, and the way music became central to the way many Americans experienced and interacted with the Civil War. Thank you.
Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. What keeps you up at night, yeah. Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. Oh yeah, I think that we've all had enough. Sick of dealing with the old plan. They know that we're calling it wrong. You got me like, oh yeah, I think that we've all had enough. It's too late to try to go contain it. A generation fueled by creation. We live lives on a small screen nation. We control the airwaves, no negotiation. I refuse to think we need saving. Something good will come from creation. And when we think that the world is too anxious, we'll adapt, evolve, survive, and save it. What keeps you up at night, yeah. Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. What keeps you up at night, yeah. Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah.